We begin with a problem. God's out for blood. In fact, the law requires that nearly everything be cleansed with blood, and without the shedding of blood there is no forgiveness. Why? God makes the rules. Why did he make bloodshed a requirement for atonement? I mentioned Isaiah 6 last time. It reads, "Woe to me, I cried, I am ruined. For I am a man of unclean lips, and I live among a people of unclean lips, and my eyes have seen the King, the Lord Almighty." Then one of the seraphim flew to me with a live coal in his hand, which he had taken with tongs from the altar. With it he touched my mouth and said, "See, this has touched your lips. Your guilt is taken away, and your sin is atoned for." Why can't God call his angels to wander the earth with these altar coals, touching all of our lips? Sign me up. Burn my lips off. But I'm afraid that Isaiah 6 falls into that context bin we discussed a while back. Can I take this passage literally? Is it fair to yearn for burning tongue atonement? Truth is, from right after the beginning, we see blood. After cursing Adam and Eve and the serpent, quote, "The Lord God made garments of skin for Adam and his wife and clothed them." From what I've read, most scholars agree that God killed some animals here. God kills first. That's fascinating. Dan Carlin, podcast non-historian extraordinaire, in several of his historical podcasts, has tried to grapple with the traumatic ramifications of killing someone. He references a book by Lieutenant Colonel Dave Grossman. One of Carlin's takeaways from the book, that looks at militaristic killings, is that the closer you physically get to the person you are killing, the more trauma you endure. Therefore, those who coordinate drones to drop bombs on hundreds of people will experience less PTSD than the dude who had to bayonet some Japanese fighter on some unknown, unnamed Indonesian island in World War II. In other words, the closer you get to killing, the more trauma you experience from the killing. But match that with this quote from Dave Grossman's book on killing. The basic response stages to killing in combat are concern about killing, the actual kill, exhilaration, remorse, and rationalization and acceptance. Did you catch it? That word in the middle. Between remorse and kill? Exhilaration.
Are you not entertained?
Truth is, as a society, we love violence. I love violence. Why is The Passion of the Christ the best-selling R-rated movie of all time? Sure, we tell each other it's because it's authentic. Mel Gibson had his blue-eyed actor playing Jesus speaking Aramaic, for gosh sake. But come on, that's not it. You watched it for the gore. I did too. We're pulled in by the violence. Something deep within us is excited by it. Exhilarated by it. So I can blame God for blood. I can. But it's unfair unless I look at us too. We are to blame for blood. We love it. It's gross to me that all these real-life documentaries about serial killers do so well. We lap them up. We're fascinated by them. We say with our logical minds that we're better than these creepos. But, Sufjan Stevens begs to differ. I fell in love with Sufjan's music way back in fall of 2004. I was a freshman in college, all the world my oyster, and someone played this song for me. It was about John Wayne Gacy, the serial killer. It's an absolutely beautiful song about an unconscionably heinous man. Then the song ends with these lines.
In my best behavior, I am really just like him. Look beneath the floorboards for the secrets I have hid.
Gracefully, Sufjan doesn't go low with those final lyrics. To go low would be to suggest that we are just like the serial rapist, torturer, and murderer John Wayne Gacy. No, instead Sufjan points the finger at himself. I am just like him. Okay, let's play a little heretical tennis. Here we go. On one side, we've got God. On the other, mankind. Who's to blame for the bloodlust in the world? God, being God, gets the first serve. In Genesis chapter 4, Cain bludgeons his brother. Then God speaks to Cain. What have you done? Listen, your brother's blood cries out to me from the ground. This close encounter with God breaks my heart and starts humanity off with a loss. After Cain comes Lamech. Lamech is Cain's great-great-great-great-grandson. He tells his wives in Genesis 4:23, I have killed a man for wounding me, a young man for injuring me, If Cain is avenged 7 times, then Lamech 77 times. Contrast vengeful Lamech with Jesus' words in Matthew 18:21 and 22. Then Peter came up to him and said, "Lord, how often will my brother sin against me, and I forgive him? As many as 7 times?" Jesus said to him, "I do not say to you 7 times, but 77 times. It's Lamech and his ilk that are out for blood. Still God serve. God promises Abram that he'll have a son. Abram wants to know how he can know this to be true. How can he trust God here? God said to him, "Bring me a heifer 3 years old, a female goat 3 years old, a ram 3 years old, a turtle dove, and a young pigeon." And Abram brought him all these, cut them in half, and laid each half against the other. Why do we have to cut animals in half to make a promise? Why the need for blood? After the flood, God makes a covenant with Noah by making rainbows. Rainbows! Why do we have to cut up animals? Can't we just make more rainbows? Let's stop. I don't want to play heretical tennis anymore. I don't even care who to blame for the blood. We just have to deal with the blood. Just like how Cain kills one person, and a couple verses later Lamech is multiplying that sin, so too it is with bloodshed in God's covenants and directives. Once we get to the Exodus, the violence gets real quick. Numbers 31:13-17. Moses, Eleazar the priest, and all the leaders of the community went to meet them outside the camp. Moses was angry with the officers of the army, the commanders of the thousands and commanders of hundreds, who returned from the battle. "Have you allowed all the women to live?" he asked them. They were the ones who followed Balaam's advice and enticed the Israelites to be unfaithful to the Lord in the Peor incident, so that a plague struck the Lord's people. Now kill all the boys, and kill every woman who has slept with a man. But save for yourselves every girl who has never slept with a man. Moses, good old Moses, he's angry with his army commanders for not killing enough. Sure, there's lots of theology out there about how the Midianites, who the Israelites just fought here, had Nephilim in them, which is like satanic angel blood, and that God needed to wipe out that line in order to prevent the evil angelic intervention in the history of the world. But if that's the case, why do they keep the virgin girls for themselves? This is dark. It feels bad. It reads the same way that all the Roman histories of plundering read. Human history is pockmarked with sickening battles that result in horrendous crimes against humanity. So we had Moses in the Exodus. Then Joshua and his successful campaigns against the peoples inhabiting the Promised Land. One instance reads, "They devoted the city to the Lord and destroyed with the sword every living thing in it. Men and women, young and old, cattle, sheep, and donkeys." Why even the animals? And then we get the Book of Judges. It's a horror show. Why on earth Samson is commonly treated as a biblical hero that we teach our little ones about, I may never know. The entire book reads pretty straightforward to me. Blood begets blood begets blood. By the end of it, the land is overcome with cries from the blood spilled. A woman raped to death sparks a civil war. Gideon asks this before becoming a William Wallace-esque judge for the Israelites. If the Lord is with us, why then has all this happened to us? I feel that. The book ends with this sentence: "Everyone did what was right in his own eyes." We go on and we get David, a king after God's own heart, who still, even on his deathbed, is asking his closest allies and friends to go out and kill some people. This history of violence repeats and repeats itself. Not just repeats, multiplies. Just like how the world had never seen tragedies the likes of World War I until the atrocities of World War II dwarfed its predecessor. We are addicted to carnage. It seems to me then, and here I go back to a heretical line of thinking, that God should have found another way to bring up Moses, to bring up Israel. Why not just do the grim work himself? Like he says he did in 2 Kings 19:35. The terrifying Assyrians were at the doorstep, and then, quote, "That night the angel of the Lord went out and put to death 185,000 in the Assyrian camp. When the people got up the next morning, there were all the dead bodies." So why not just have the angel of the Lord knock out all the Midianites? Why not make the Levitical laws full of rainbows? Why not make the temple rituals all about, I don't know, using magnets or pouring out water and wine on the altar? Why? Why the blood? Don't you know how this addiction thing works, God? Don't you know how generational trauma works? A child of an alcoholic parent is 45 to 79% more likely to grow up to be an alcoholic than his peers. A study in the UK showed that children who were not abused as kids only grew up to be abusers 13% of the time. However, the more types of abuse children experienced, the more likely they were to become abusers, with those who experienced 4 types of abuse becoming abusers themselves 77% of the time. 13% no abuse, 77% when you have been abused. Those Midianite virgin girls who watched their families be killed before being taken by Israelite men. How many abuses did they suffer? How many abuses would their Israelite children inherit because they suffered? The theologian Marcion looked at all this, compared it to Jesus, the one who insisted on forgiving 77 times instead of killing 77 times, and came to the conclusion that the God of the New Testament can't be the God of the Old Testament. He simply found them too incongruent, too dissimilar. It's hard not to see his point. How can I reconcile the God who told Moses to kill with the killed for us, Jesus? Gregory Boyd wrote an opus trying to ascertain the answer to that painful question in a 2-volume set entitled The Crucifixion of the Warrior God. Full disclosure, I've tried to read it twice and got bogged down both times. Perhaps, though, I should try a third, because this is a question that can completely alter how I act as a Christian. Boyd's idea, what he calls the Cruciform Hermeneutic, is that we must start with Jesus and work backwards. Great, I love doing that. But, how does one do that with any human being who is permanently dedicated to the Lord must not be ransomed? Such a person must be put to death. Thanks, Leviticus, you're a real one. Boyd's answer is laid out in the preface of his book when he wrote, God, who is indiscriminate in his love and nonviolence, had to accommodate his self-revelation to the spiritual state and cultural conditioning of his people in the ages leading up to Christ. What's that mean? I think Boyd is saying that God worked within culture to slowly move us in the direction of Jesus. God works within culture, and rather than forcing mankind to take a giant leap, he has man take a small step, one small step at a time. Why split the animals in half to make the Abrahamic covenant? Because that was already a cultural norm for creating a shared covenant. Going from memory here, I believe Boyd is also careful to say that much of the genocide and killing in the OT is man's idea, that God simply allows or accommodates that. I'm uneasy with accepting this idea whole cloth, probably because I still don't understand it, and I don't know how to go about applying it to particular passages. One harsh critic in his review of Boyd's book wrote, in its application, Boyd's Cruciform Hermeneutic is less a hermeneutic than it is a scissors and paste attempt to bleach from the OT what is seemingly, i.e. humanly, untenable. For me, at the end of the day, it's less the violence itself that bothers me, but what I know violence does to people. Violence begets violence. This is where I find myself lost between camps, desperately running to and fro looking for a means by which to understand. And not just understand, but ally myself with God. Right? That's where I want to be. Somewhere where I can easily put my flag down and say, come hell or high water, I am with you, Lord. The violence, vindictiveness, and seeming disregard for life that God appears to be, at times in the Old Testament, pushes me to become the doubter that James, the brother of Jesus, describes as, the one who doubts is like a wave of the sea, blown and tossed by the wind. That person should not expect to receive anything from the Lord. Such a person is double-minded and unstable in all they do. That's me. I confess this. If I go with Greg Boyd's Cruciform Hermeneutic, I have so much that I have to consider when I read the Old Testament text. I have to read it plainly, I have to read it for literary and cultural allusions, I have to read it for literary genre, I have to read it through a filter of cultural norms of the day, I have to read it cautiously for meaning and nuances lost in translation to English, and now I have to read it through a Cruciform Hermeneutic that says that God is non-invasively moving the souls of the Jewish protagonists in the story toward a more Christ-like visage. Boyd calls this cruciform accommodation. The Gospel Coalition summarized Boyd's view of this by stating that this conception of accommodation permits Boyd to read the Old Testament as the faulty, culturally bound human record of encounters with and perspectives of God, while simultaneously affirming God's non-coercive involvement in permitting his character to be tarnished by his people. The Old Testament is thoroughly human without being purely human. Okay, that makes reading the scriptures with any sort of certainty almost impossible without divine intervention. The story of God, the story of mankind, as expressed in the Hebrew Bible, aka the Old Testament, is unreasonably complex. That's exhilarating, but it's also demoralizing, as I find myself at the end of my wits trying to grasp the big picture. Maybe that's part of it. Maybe we're supposed to come to the end of our own ability to discern the narrative. In desperation, then, I look beneath the floorboards.
In my best behavior, I am really just like him.
And about that big picture, if I'm to believe that God worked through history, or at least Jewish history, to move the cultural needle towards something more godlike, then I start feeling like the philosophy of Hegel is at play here. And Hegelianism makes my tummy hurt. I find myself at a fork in the road. I accept that the true character of God is hidden within the bloody texts and contexts of the Old Testament, or I accept that God uses people to spoon out bloody judgment to the first and the second and the third and the fourth generations. I don't want to accept either option. What I want to do is what Marcion did. Erase those humanly untenable sections of the Hebrew scriptures. But I can't. Again, Hebrews 9:22. Without the shedding of blood, there is no forgiveness. Instead of choosing a path in this forked road I find myself in, I'm just going to read Wilfred Owen's poem about World War I, a war he would later die fighting in. Bent double like old beggars under sacks, knock-kneed, coughing like hags, we cursed through sludge, till on the haunting flares we turned our backs, and towards our distant rest began to trudge. Men marched asleep, many had lost their boots, but limped on bloodshot. All went lame, all blind, drunk with fatigue, deaf even to the hoots of gas shells dropping softly behind. Gas, gas, quick boys, an ecstasy of fumbling, fitting the clumsy helmets just in time, but someone still was yelling out and stumbling, and floundering like a man in fire or lime. Dim through the misty panes and thick green light, as under a green sea, I saw him drowning. In all my dreams before my helpless sight, he plunges at me, guttering, choking, drowning. If in some smothering dreams you too could pace behind the wagon that we flung him in, and watch the white eyes writhing in his face, his hanging face like a devil's sick of sin, if you could hear at every jolt of the blood come gargling from the froth-corrupted lungs, obscene as cancer, bitter as the cud, of vile, incurable sores on innocent tongues, my friend, you would not tell with such high zest. To children ardent for some desperate glory, the old lie, dulce et decorum est pro patria mori.